Mr. Sanyal as well as Manish, appreciate you both taking your time out and speaking with us today. Mr. Sanyal, we couldn't really have you at a better time. The finance minister, in fact, was just a while ago speaking in the parliament as well and addressing some of the queries relating to the budget. And let me first, in fact, begin by asking you about the budget. It's winning hearts in the markets, it's getting accolades, and it is a budget that a lot of future budgets are going to be compared to, whether it is the transparency, whether it is on the transparency metric or on the public debt policy metric or privatization, or the fact that there were no tax hikes and a lot of supply side measures that were undertaken. Really a one-of-the-kind budget that we have seen that has been brought forth by the government. You yourself had been saying that we will push the pedal when it means the most. So I want to begin by asking you, what really brought about the ideological shift of stance?
Actually, it's not an ideological shift of stance at all. I mean, right from the beginning, Prime Minister has been talking about minimum government, maximum governance, and that is basically our strategy. And even in the more shorter term, in terms of the demand management and the management of the COVID cycle, we throughout said that, look, there was no point in trying to push demand when we had a lockdown. As I said, there's no point in pushing the accelerator when you've got your foot on the brake. So as things opened up, we recognized that the economy needed support, and we have been building that up. But we have a very specific way of going about it, which is we do not think that there is, once the lockdown was over, that we should be giving out stimulus checks and doing some indirect way of stimulating demand. We have taken a much more direct approach of going for infrastructure build-out, which has two advantages. One, that it directly stokes demand, creates jobs, and so on. And of course, it has the other advantage that it leaves behind assets for future generations, who, after all, will have to repay much of this debt.
Right. Absolutely. In fact, while we're talking about that, Manish, if I can, get you on board, a lot of people are likening it to the 91 reforms. Many are saying that it could be this budget is as good as the 97 dream budget as well. In fact, the chief economic advisor also, while presenting the economic survey and the budget, said that the causality in this budget is very different. A low fiscal deficit does not really mean, high growth. The idea, of course, is to give it a break, move on, end the tyranny of rating agencies. Would you, in that sense, really say that now, in terms of the path that we are on, we're finally on the path that many other Asian nations are already on?
No, I agree, Ruchi. And in fact, instead of answering, I would pose a question to Sanjeev, because, our job is to actually interpret government and its action, and it's popularly elected one. And of course, it's moving in a certain direction and perhaps is being inspired by many other nations. So, my question to Sanjeev actually is how I think there is some ideological shift, Sanjeev. And would you concur with this? Is there a change in the sort of a developmental model that India is pursuing, At least, because I'm also a student of history, and I think that as a country, we shifted from British exploitation Raj to a socialistic setup after independence, and then straight away entered into a West-styled free market or laissez-faire. Is there a relook at that? And so a role of tariff, currency policies, the arguments that Niti Aayog and the finance minister and many others have made about the champions, the privately owned national champions. The Wednesday speech from Modi was, in some sense, was an endorsement for private businesses, and it was absolutely phenomenal listening to him. I really can't believe, in at least 20-25 years of watching Indian politics, I haven't seen a politician of his stature come forward and talk about private enterprises. So my question to Sanjeev actually is that I think there is a little bit of an ideological shift, and in a manner that I try to weave. Is that true, or it's not so?
Well, there is no question that we have a very clear growth model. And if you've read the last 3 economic surveys, which I co-author, as you know, you will see that we have laid out exactly what we wanted to do. We talked about an investment-driven growth model. If you look at 2 economic surveys back, the last one laid out several measures, whether it's labor laws, farm laws, talked about dwarfism in our firms. So we were basically going for a certain model, and in this particular one, we have now talked about deregulation. If you read Chapter 6 of the Economic Survey, Volume 1, so there is clearly a framework of thinking about the world which is consistent. And yes, there will be echoes of some things, for example, what East Asia did, but you will also find, interestingly, echoes from our own long history, economic history. So it's full of Thiruvalluvar and Chanakya and so on as well. But if you will grant me a half a minute, I also have a hat as a historian, and I think it's important to understand the arc of history here. Before 1991, we basically had the nature of the Indian state was basically a weak but all-pervasive state. After 1991, we opened it up, but when we did open it up, it was not because of some ideological or intellectual change. It happened because our economy went through a major crisis and we were forced to change it. But the ideological framework, by and large, remained the same. So whatever reforms happened in a very apologetic sort of way, whenever it needed to be done. And it's only when, during the period of Prime Minister Vajpayee, it saw a bit of a fillip. And then again, there were no reforms at all, although we did get the benefits of that in the subsequent decades. But then what the opening up that did happen ultimately built out a new entrepreneurial class, but it didn't have the architecture needed for it. So what happened is you continued with the old public sector on one hand, and the opened up private sector, it's very quickly morphed into a sort of a crony capitalist system. So all that had happened, we had gone from crony socialism to crony capitalism, but the cronies had still remained. What really happened between 2014 and 2019 is that part of the system had to be fixed and was fixed. And that is the context in which the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code was put in, the banks were cleaned up, a lot of effort was put into essentially imposing some sort of an order in the system, because before you go in for minimum government, you need some sort of governance in place. So that governance was put in place. Now you can do the minimum government part and open things up. And that is the phase we are now going into. It is a new phase. And it is, yes, you can say that if you break up our history, if you have, early 50s when we introduced a certain economic model, 1991, we opened it up in a certain way. And you can say 2021, effectively, I would argue it started in 2020 because we did many of these reforms over the last 1 year. We clearly have now moved on to a new model of investment-driven growth, driven by entrepreneurship on one side from the private sector, and the government doing its role, but basically by providing infrastructure and the necessary conditions.
So Sanjeev, just a small question in terms of, I actually want to understand, because it's something new and it's not well defined, at least in a political sphere, or that, this whole idea of national champions, how is it different from, let's say, something like what Korea had, Jaebuls or Japanese Jaibatsus, is this the idea different, or it's sort of trying to replicate that?
Well, we have to be a little careful because, the country is different, the circumstances, our political economy is different. So we can't have national champions in the way you had chaebols and things. And in some ways, we may not even need them because unlike, say, South Korea, we have a large internal market which can allow large companies to evolve even organically internally, even if we have to provide some support of various kinds. But it is possible to do that. It had to be done. In fact, it was more difficult to say for a Singapore to create a national champion because it has no internal market at all. So we have, our circumstances allow us to create those. But let's say, even there, we had to first create an internal market. I mean, that's what the GST was about. Not so long ago, it was easier for Mumbai to trade with Shanghai than for Mumbai to trade with Delhi. Whatever may have been the problems of introducing GST, the fact is now it is a relatively smooth system. Almost any fair person will say that it is dramatic improvement on whatever was there before. But most importantly, we now have a common market. And that common market can now be leveraged.
I understand.
Right. Mrs. Sanyal, let me ask you, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Execution is going to be key. Everybody's been saying that this budget, of course, is bringing a lot of optimism on the table, but it needs to see its way onto the ground as well. So what is the government going to do to make sure that over the next 12 years, this optimism is retained and we're really able to walk the talk on not just reforms, but announcements that have been made as well?
Well, as you yourself said, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. But you can clearly see that even during very difficult times, like for example during the lockdown, we have been able to hold our nerve and do difficult things. So this is a government that doesn't get swayed by international experts asking us to do a big stimulus package. Or other countries doing various things. We stick by our path, by what we believe, and we have shown that we are quite capable of taking difficult decisions, even politically difficult decisions, and standing by them. So we have a track record. We also have administrative capacity. After all, we have 1.35 billion people were taking through the world's the biggest shock in a century, and I think we managed it. So I think as a country. And as a society, we need to have a little more confidence in ourselves. And that's what Atmanirbhar Bharat is about. I think, we tend to almost start with the assumption that whatever the Indians are doing is somehow substandard. It's not the case. It's our vaccines that are going to vaccinate the world. Our strategies were better than those of most of the West. So we need to begin to have some confidence in ourselves and not get swayed by whatever the rest of the world may be telling us. I'm not saying we shouldn't listen to the rest of the world, but then at the end, we should use our common sense and have confidence in ourselves.
So, let me just get a quick follow up on that as well. For example, the farm laws that have become a major issue of public protest as well as debate. Given the fact that the next era of reforms are also going to be tough, just like this, and given your experience in public policy, do you think that the recent set of protests could stall the reform process given its political cost?
Well, I can't answer for the political class, but clearly this privatization effort was announced well after these protests were underway. So, I mean, clearly the political leadership has already taken this into account and is willing to go forward. And I think that is quite right. I mean, the fact of the matter is, we debated labor laws for 30 years. Some of them when I was at university, 3 decades ago. And they finally got done. These labor laws have been discussed over and over again by every economist worth their salt. They've been written into the economic surveys over years, and by the very economists who are now grumbling about them. But it is this government that got it done. And the same thing is true. I mean, everybody agrees that privatization of some sort needs to be given a fillip. By the way, there are some kinds of areas where the public sector does have a role. And we intend to keep them there, that they have been demarcated as strategic sector. And by the way, we are even willing to create new public sector enterprises or body entities like the new Development Finance Institution. So we are practical about this. But clearly there is no role for Indian government to be running hotels, airlines, and those kinds of institutions, or even petrol pumps for that matter. So, in those areas, it's perfectly fine, I think, to leave. And I think there is support for this. I think people will be surprised how much support there is on the ground for many of these reforms. I think people underestimate this just because those who oppose it tend to be very vocal. You assume that is what the support on the ground is. And I think speaking to young people in universities around the country, speaking to many, as part of my job, I do that all the time over the last few years. I think people are much more ready for radical change than people realize.
So, I mean, Sanjeev, again, to contextualize the proof of success, there are many markers, I would imagine. One of them would be perhaps how much of a sort of external capital we are able to attract to set up factories in India and eventually export to the rest of the world. And you're right that economic surveys talked about it 2.5 years ago. Now, again, would this be fair to say that, this is the way to judge the success over the next couple of years? And then, to sort of think of a small data point here, I think a research report by Bernstein was there last week. And I saw that of the 75 firms who left China in last 1 year, 10% came to India and about 1/3 went to Vietnam. Now, by the way, 10% is great news because 2018 it was near zero. I want to ask this question, that what explains that a tiny country whose population is less than of your West Bengal and a GDP of less than of Karnataka can do this? What is it in them that we can't replicate? Do you have a sense of?
Well, I mean, the Vietnamese government has clearly done well, and good for them. And they did that even with the COVID response. They have an exceptional record of them. And as I said, I admire their ability to do this, but that does not mean that we do not have the will or the capacity to do this. We had a more difficult task as far as managing this COVID situation was, as a much bigger country and more complicated country, and we have done a reasonable job. Our industrial capacities and capabilities are at a different level from theirs. So while I agree Vietnam has been successful and I wish them very well, they are an ally of ours, so I always wish them well, and that is also true of Bangladesh, another country with whom we have good relations. But I think you'll be surprised how much of FDI and other investment is now flowing into India, even as we speak. The PLI scheme has been a big success, although the actual, the bricks are not yet been laid from that, but they will be very, very shortly. And even through the pandemic period, FDI flows into India were at record levels. So I think, we are doing reasonably well, and that is gathering pace. But I would argue that FDI or even portfolio investment is not the only gauge of our success in putting these policies together. Ultimately, we have to have growth, and we have to create jobs, and the confidence that Indians have in themselves is ultimately what will drive this. So I think what we really need is to get Indian private sectors, animal spirits up and running. And I think that is what will really be the ultimate test of this. And the Prime Minister on the floor of the House, day before yesterday, made a pitch saying that this is ultimately our growth model. We want our private sector fired up, investing, and taking risks and introducing new technologies. And that is something that we need to see. And we have full confidence that will happen. After all, we did reduce tax rates very dramatically about 18 months ago. The benefits of that, unfortunately, got a little disrupted because of this phase, but I think the benefits of that will begin to flow shortly.
No, I agree. I think I've shared with you that, I speak to Niti Aayog people, and I'm absolutely happy to see red hot, FDI pipeline, Sanjeev, that sort of you alluded to. Just for reference, of course, India used to export, about 4 or 5 times of Vietnam 20 years ago, and it's equal today. So, in a sense, so much can be achieved by specific policies, and I only hope that we get there. And I think large part of Vietnam's resurgence has been because of FDI. But okay, just a supplementary question on potential growth, given that you talked about in the end, the marker will be growth. If for good 5, 10, 20, 25 years, our base growth has been 6.5%, which is a great deal. And, had China not happened, we would have been considered as a miracle economy. But then in the same time, China was double digit. Can you sort of lay out a framework to think of next decade, Sanjeev, in terms of what kind of potential growth that institutions, market should start to think of for India, and lay the framework in terms of base growth of 6.5 plus what all where all will be able to exploit excess growth?
Well, obviously, what you're asking for is not the growth in the next 1 or 2 years, which we expect them to be quite high. The IMF expects 11.5% real GDP growth rate. So that is obviously. That's just a short run based on a bounce from last year's downturn. But if you're taking a decade or so into account, I think India is capable of growing certainly at the rate of 8% or thereabouts. And there are many things in our favor. I know everybody has talked about demographics for a very, very long time. But the fact is we are now into that demographic phase. We are probably into the second year or so of the peak phase. But we will be here for 25 years.
Yes.
China, on the other hand, is coming off it. It's already off it. As of 2015, it's off its peak. It's still close to the peak, but it's off its peak. But from around, by about 5-6 years from now, its demographics really drops. Before 2030, its demographics really sharply drops when the one-child policy, the impact of the one-child policy begins impacting them. So we are just about entered this phase. This is a phase in which we should basically go for investment-driven growth, which is what I pitched for all this while. Some of this investment obviously will come from FDI, but we need our own economy to drive it. And that will require our financial system to dramatically scale up. Now, I know you're from the capital markets. The equity market part has relatively more developed. But the place where we are truly underdeveloped is our bank and non-bank sector. That is very small. And ultimately, the very sizable part of the push of growth will have to come from a banking system that is a scale of magnitude larger than what is today. Now, how can we do this? Now, one of the problems was always that we had a banking system that, if we dramatically scaled up, would break down. Repeatedly we would have this phenomena that you would, for a variety of reasons, you would go through a boom, or you would want, in response to a downturn, you would open up the gates, and then the banking system would expand for a few years, but then it would stall because it would have all these NPAs building up. And we had one episode of that just in the last decade, but we have gone through this before as well. So this is why the banking system never gets going. So one of the key things was to clean up the banking system and change its culture.
Right.
And this is basically what the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code is about. All this thought about privatization comes from that same line of thought. Basically, we need a competitive banking system which can be 5 times its current size, because that is what will be one of the legs on which the financing of this expansion will happen. And so cheap capital,
right,
put together with good demographics, reasonably sensible economic policies and deregulation, and let the magic happen.
You pretty much preempted my next question, and I was about to ask you about financial sector vulnerabilities. While we're talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat, we really have to fix our banks. And if you go by what the RBI has recently said as well, that post-COVID, once we wind up the regulatory forbearance, there is a possibility that in the worst case scenario, we may see gross NPAs of close to 16.2% as far as PSU banks go. On the other hand, the government has promised that there's going to be a privatization drive as well. There are 2 legs to this question that I want to ask. A, what will you do to fix the Indian banking system? Because that is, of course, a huge problem at this point of time. Secondly, on the privatization end, how will you ensure that you're able to protect the buyers as well from any kind of a legal trouble later?
First of all, let me say that media loves looking at the stress testing worst case scenarios. That is not what RBI is forecasting. It just did a stress test, and that is the worst case scenario. And even there, my sense is that when they did this test back in November, the situation was our sort of confidence in the system was different from what it is now. Almost every discussion I have with the banking system suggests that while there will be some impact of the COVID, we will probably get away with it much better than virtually any country in the world. So I think our banking system, yes, there'll be some impact, but I think the net impact on NPAs is going to be actually very well within manageable levels. And I think virtually any risk, as I said, Manish may have a better view on this because he's probably does this even more frequently than I do. But my own sense is that we will come off better. Now, why is that? Well, it happens to be because we spent 3 years cleaning up the banking system going into this crisis. So the system was not leveraged. The NBFCs were not leveraged. Much of the rubbish had already been cleared out and demarcated. So anybody who has taken a loan genuinely wanted it and had a business that worked. Now, of course, during the lockdown itself, we had to provide forbearance because you don't want cascades of default. But what I hear is that even there, not too many people are coming up and asking for restructuring and so on. So by and large, it tells me what? That yes, some impact, but not very much. I think the problem will really arise in the rest of the world. India will look good. But once we get past this phase, once we've cleaned it up and, I think by the end of the year, when we will be reasonably ready to get going, I think we will then have perhaps a decade of expansion in our banking system.
Also, if you can just come in on the privatization bit, how are you really looking to ensure that the buyers are really protected from any kind of legal troubles at a later stage? Because that's going to be key to the success of not just the privatization plan, but the privatization for the two banks and one general insurance company as well.
No, I think that is true for every privatization. You want to do it as neatly as possible so that the people who buy it are not penalized, because after all, our purpose in selling is not just to make some money. That is actually the side reason why privatization is a good thing. The real reason you want to do privatization is that these assets can then be used more productively for the wider economy. That is why you really want to do it. And so my own sense is that we will take every care to make sure that these kinds of legal issues don't happen. But as you yourself said, the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
Right. Manish, if you can come in on that, on financial sector vulnerabilities, how critical do you think it would be for the government to act on ensuring that some of the troubles with the banking system can be dealt with at this point of time? As Mr. Sanyal is saying, he doesn't expect it to be as worse as what probably we guys are looking at this point of time.
No, in fact, I'm actually a little more bullish than Sanjeev, and I've shared with him and for a good 7-8 months, that this whole idea that the banks would be snowed under with a lot of NPAs, basically does not recognize that banking over the last 5-7 years has undergone a big change, and the sort of new credit, retail primarily, which is done by banks, is rule-based and therefore is behaving very well. 80-85% of our incremental retail credit actually goes to what you call people with CIBIL score of 750 plus. That's a super prime customer and does not seem to misbehave. And I mean, perhaps was actually he actually did benefit from lockdown because he saved a little more. And that's what has played out in the world, but in India too. So I think what RBI put out, Sanjeev is right, that is model based, but it's sort of spooked some people. I think it's fair to say that the total COVID cost for our financial intermediation will not be more than 1.5%. But Sanjeev, I'll come in here with one or two questions for you. One is about currency and bonds. You've been a votary of getting foreign money in Indian bonds, and you've talked about inclusion of government bonds in bond indices. But then, we live in a setting where we are overwhelmed with the kind of flows which are hitting us. And it is, of course, making the situation difficult for RBI to absorb all these flows because it invariably leads to more liquidity. So are you sort of worried of the angle of impossible trinity now that, if so much money is already coming in, would you still say that you need money from outsiders, to participate in Indian bonds? That's question number one. And number two is that, again, you made this point many times that the Indian rate should be much lower. Rajan sold us this idea that inflation targeting will eventually bring down term premia, but it never happened, and Indian term premias have secularly moved up. Solve it for us, in terms of why Indian rates haven't come down as much, and is there a utility function of sort of low rates in India, and what can be done about it?
So first of all, I think as far as opening up the bond market is concerned for global indices, etc., that's obviously in process, and hopefully will get included at some point. That is a long-term measure. We can't be for short-term liquidity surges. We can't go in and out of indices. So I think we have a model that works. It is able to absorb large inflows. We can accumulate them into reserves if we don't want the exchange rate to move too much, and we have accumulated indeed quite a lot of reserves. We are now nearing $600 billion in reserves, and are, in fact, people don't realize this, we are now a net lender country, we are a net creditor country to the world, because our reserves are now higher than our external debt, including private sector debt. So that's one side. Meanwhile, as far as managing the liquidity is concerned, well, we also have a significant borrowing program from the government, so we will take advantage of it. That the sterilization or to the extent that is necessary can very easily be managed by the central bank because they have the bonds with which to sterilize. I don't think they're running out of bonds. So in that context, I think as far as monetary management is concerned, we have a reasonably well set system, which is frankly quite easy. We'll be able to manage this situation quite easily. I don't think that is our big concern. The more complicated question that you have asked is what happened to the yield curve given what has happened to inflation. Now, inflation targeting has succeeded in what it set out to do, which was to bring inflation into a certain band. We were a country that used to have 8 to 12% inflation. Now we are a 2 to 6% inflation country. This is not a trivial thing, by the way. We have genuinely lowered the inflation sort of pathway in this country. And we went through the pain of doing it. It's painful to do, bringing down the inflation pathway by some 600 basis points is not a trivial thing. It would have been painful anywhere in the world, and we have done it. So my sense is that we shouldn't mess with it. The question then arises is why is the yield curve not taking this into account? And there may be many reasons. You may be a better sense of this, but it takes time for these things to settle. I think one thing that has happened is one part of it is that the whole yield curve has moved down, but the near end of it has moved down more. I mean, at some level, rather than take the shape of the yield curve or its slope, look at what has happened to very near term. I mean, we can raise money for 1 year, 3.5% or something even less. I don't know. So that is not a trivial thing to be able to raise these kinds of money in a situation, by the way, where we clearly have to borrow a lot more. And for all the complaining people are doing about, what will happen to the borrowing program, I mean, the yield curve, the 10-year rate has moved by a few basis points. It's no big deal. We have come a long, long way. I mean, not so long ago, this would have caused chaos in the bond markets, but the bond market has taken its stride and will continue. And I think as the confidence in India grows, and if we do get included in the bond indices, I think the cost of capital overall will come down.
So, I mean, just a small point here. I mean, is that governor, of course, has talked about this, that yield curve is actually a public good, and there is sort of a collective, or he uses the word shared responsibility of markets and RBI to ensure that there is an orderly evolution of curve. Again, you seem to make this point that, okay, we've taken it in our stride, but the fact is that, had RBI not intervened aggressively, even in the last few days, rates would have actually backed up meaningfully. The question I'm asking is that, this whole idea that...
So let me say, I agree with the RBI governor. It's a public good. And it is the role of the central bank of every country to provide that public good. And they are doing exactly that. They are providing you the public good by intervening. How else will they provide it? Mm-hmm. That's right. Exactly what you should expect them to do.
Okay.
I also wanted to get a sense from you, and since we're talking about the rupee market, the strategy of the RBI at this point of time seems to be clear that the central bank has a bias towards a weaker rupee, given the aggressive dollar purchases that it has been making for some time as well. The aggressive intervention from the RBI has also brought the rupee back on the US currency manipulation risk, list as well. Is keeping a rupee at a certain level to help imports one of the outcomes that we're really looking at? And in your opinion, Mr. Sanyal, what seems to be the strategy here that the RBI is looking at?
So we have had a well-established way of managing the rupee now for some time, over decades in fact, which is that we have a pragmatic view. In the very long run, we look at the real effective exchange rate, but in the short run, we basically lean against the wind. So when it is falling very sharply, we lean against the wind by using reserves. When it is appreciating sharply, we accumulate reserves. But at the same time, we allow the market to drift it in a particular direction. So I think the Reserve Bank will pragmatically look at this and allow it to adjust in the medium term in the direction. But meanwhile, I think they are right in not allowing the exchange rate to move in either direction too much, and using foreign exchange reserves as a sort of a way to moderate volatility. I think that is a good thing. They will continue to do that, and if and they will also take into account whatever, say, other countries may be looking at this. After all, this is a two-way process. An exchange rate is not, it's a relative, it's not an absolute indicator. So, of course, if other countries are looking at it, for example, the US will also look at it, then we will take those into our calculations in our response.
I also just have another follow-up, and since you were mentioning about the inflation targeting framework as well, that's up for a review now in the month of April. What is the view that the government is taking on it? Because this is going to be one thing I'm sure that the bond markets as well as Mint Street would be very, very closely looking out for.
So I think, the inflation targeting system was set up to do something. And it did a very good job of doing whatever that thing it was asked to do, which was to anchor inflation to a lower level. As I said, it's a painful thing to do, but we have gone from being not a very high inflation country, we were a mid-level inflation country. So we were never, Argentina, but nevertheless, we were in a country which had 8 to 12% inflation. We are now a country where we are comfortable with 2 to 6% inflation. And it's happened in a relatively short period of time, and we have all become comfortable with it, by the way. So I think it's done. We can make some adjustments to probably smoothening it or make around it. But by and large, the framework itself, I think, has done what it's supposed to do. There are issues, however, which I think are more serious about whether or not the basket of that exchange of the CPI should be relooked at. That is something we do periodically anyway. I mean, that should be done anyway because, 10, 15 years ago, the basket would not have included, say, for example, mobile data. But now everybody's basket has mobile data in it. So ups and downs in mobile data pricing, has a direct impact on people's lives. So those things need to be introduced. And similarly, food prices are no longer that important as they used to be because it's a smaller part of our food basket than it used to be. So these adjustments are done all the time to reflect the times. And I think that is fair enough that we continue to do this on a periodic basis. There may be a case for saying that we shouldn't wait for 10 whole years before doing it and maybe do it in 5 years. That's an actual debate. I think that, updating the CPI is something that we should indeed do. And we do it, by the way. It's hardly something we have not done in the past. We do it periodically. We should do it again.
Right. And while you're saying that, we need to probably look into it and make adjustments, are you also referring to some kind of an escape clause that every time we do have an extremely loose monetary policy and fiscal policy that may have an inflationary impact, maybe that can also be kind of looked into within the inflation targeting framework as well?
No, I think one needs to be careful about having excessively prescriptive rules and regulations. A rule works when it's simple. And most people understand that their circumstances may require you to go around them. So, if something like COVID happens and there are disruptions in food supplies and it causes food supplies to spike here or there, I don't think anybody blames the Reserve Bank for it. So, same thing is true for the fiscal rules as well. I mean, I don't think anybody has suddenly gone and said, oh, but what about FRBN? No, there are circumstances where you go off the path, and then you slowly bring it back. So I think the beauty of successful rules is in its simplicity. And then, you allow for the exceptions to play themselves out. There are, of course, a monetary policy committee with sensible people in it. And when the need is there to deviate, they should deviate. Same thing is true for fiscal policy or any other kind of policy. Why just this? I mean, any policy anywhere in the world should basically be simple, allow for 90% of the situations. There will be that 10 or even 2% of the situations where you have to go off, then go off. That's why you need active management. By the way, the chapter 6 in Economic Survey, volume 1, makes this particular case. That never make prescriptive rules. That's a waste of time. Have simple rules that work most of the time, and then allow for discretion for the exceptions.
So let me ask Sanjeev, this is the last question, and it's a bit sweeping and historic in nature. So I mean, given that you are a historian himself, so can you place for our audience and me today's India in geographical and historical context? You know, why I ask this question, Sanjeev, is because is there a risk of this rise of China and we antagonizing them, a country which is arguably going to be the biggest power of 21st century? I mean, world allowed a peaceful rise of China, particularly US, but would China allow a peaceful rise of our country? And how big is the risk of this Thucydidean trap, you know, and can we get into the quagmire between US and China? I mean, just the big picture.
Let me say, one of the lessons of history is that history is full of random turns, butterfly effects. So therefore, anybody trying to do long-range forecasts of where the world will be in a decade or two from now simply does not understand history at all. So if you think that India and China have not played this game, you should read history. India and China have been competing and collaborating with each other over thousands of years. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we got the better of them, sometimes they got the better of us, and sometimes the Europeans came and colonized both of us. So, this has been going on for a long time. Incidentally, since you called on me as a historian, let me say that in the 1400s, in the early 1400s, there was a period while China dominated the Indian Ocean world, and it sent these 17 grand fleets under Admiral Zheng He, and they dominated the whole region and Asia using naval power. Then what happened is that the emperor died, and the new emperor, found that he was backed by a group of bureaucrats who did not like the navy because that was run by the eunuchs, including Zheng He, who was a eunuch. So the competition between the eunuch lobby and the Confucian bureaucrats meant that the money for the eunuchs was cut off, and the navy went into decline. And as a result of which, anybody who had forecasted that China was going to take over the world was not only confounded. What happened is that the withdrawal of the Chinese is what created the vacuum into which the Portuguese and the Europeans arrived. So the world is full of unintended consequences and random, changes of direction. So the most important thing, whether you are dealing with COVID or your history, is that flexibility will always beat strength. And as the great Irish philosopher, who I like very much, Professor Conor O'Brien, has said that precision will always beat power, and timing will always beat speed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, with those wise words, I think we should stop. Ruchi?
Right. All right. Of course, a very informative session, Mr. Sanyal as well as Manish. Appreciate you both taking your time out and speaking with us.